Words, words, words. There are so many of them in the English language, so you may be wondering if it's even possible to know them all. I'm sure that you have all of them written down in those long lists of words that you hope one day you will remember, but this day is not coming, or it hasn't come yet, because the problem is that it's not you who decides which words to remember, but it is your brain. So your brain decides how to transfer these words from the piece of paper that you've written down into your long-term memory. So how do you get to make your brain do what you want to do? Well, first of all, you need to understand how your brain remembers words, what processes happen right here, and then I'll teach you a couple of strategies that will trick your brain into remember the words that you want to remember, and the whole process will become much easier. So, as I said, let's try to understand what happens from the moment when you see a word until the moment you know it, that you remember it. So, you see a word or you hear a word, and that information gets into our brain through our sensory organs, like eyes or ears, or sometimes you can even feel the word. So, this information is being transformed into electromagnetic impulses that then get into our hippocampus. Hippocampus is a part of the brain that's right there in the center and is responsible for creating memories. And it is also responsible for creating emotions. I'll tell you why it is important a bit later. So this new word in the form of an electric impulse gets into hippocampus. Right here, this word is in the realm of your short-term memory. Scientists believe that most people can retain information about no more than 7 things, and they can hold this information for no more than 20 or 30 seconds. Of course, you can keep something in your short-term memory longer by repeating it to yourself. So let's say you're trying to remember a word, and by the time those 20 seconds expire, you need to think of it again and then repeat it again and again and again. The good news is the more often you do it, the better it gets out of this short-term memory into the long memory, so you don't ever have to repeat that again. So you will just know this word for a longer time, long-term memory. But keep in mind that long-term memory doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stay there forever. You still need to keep feeding it. We'll talk about why this is happening a bit later. As you already know, hippocampus is responsible for transfer information from the short-term memory into the long-term memory, and it can do it by repetition. And the more often you repeat it, the faster and more surely you will remember that. There is also such a thing called the forgetting curve. What does it mean? If we learn a word on day 1, the information about it will fade in our memory just in a few days. But if you keep recalling it within the intervals before this word gets forgotten, you can make sure that it gets into the long-term memory. Let's say that you learned a new word on day 1, and this is the period by which you will totally forget this word if you don't recall it. So what you need to do, you need to make sure that you review this word somewhere between these 2 points to make sure that the word doesn't fall into the limbo. So if you do it right here, right before this deadline, you'll be fine. The good news is that these periods get longer and longer and longer. So in the beginning, you need to keep reviewing words as often as possible. Then you can slowly increase that interval between your review sessions. Knowing that, you can plan your reviewing schedules more efficiently. So let's get back to that new word that we are trying to remember. So what does it look like in our brain? In fact, it looks like a cluster of different pieces that constitute this word. What does it mean? When you see a word, when you understand the word, it means that you know what it looks like, so that information is there. Then you also know what it sounds like. that information adds to the same cluster. Then you know its meaning, its translation, possible collocations, its grammar function if it's a noun or a verb. Then you could also know its synonyms and antonyms. Probably already have some associations created with this word. So you see, you already have a bunch of information. But the thing is that that cluster doesn't really hang in there in your brain all by itself, like in this space. It has to be connected, and it does connect very quickly to some to other neurons in your mind, like similar words, other words starting with the same letter, and possibly the context where you encountered that word and other things. So, what do you think what happens when you forget a word? Well, it just disappears. What does it mean for other neurons in your brain? Let's think about a touristic group. Imagine you're on a day tour, all traveling together. There are 20 of you on a bus. Of course, you don't know all of them. You may know your neighbors and people in front of you, on the back, but that's probably it. Would you notice if someone, like 3 seats behind you, were late? Probably not. If you hadn't spoken to them, or there hadn't been something in their appearance that attracted your attention explicitly, there is a high chance that you didn't even know that the person existed. Well, the same thing happens to our new memories. Unless they're connected to other memories, no one would notice if they get lost. So you need to connect them to as many neurons as you can to make sure that they will not disappear unnoticed. You know that feeling when you feel like you know this word, you used to know it, it's somewhere on the tip of your tongue, but you can't get it. You can't even say what it sounds like. You kind of it's it's an it's a horrible feeling. You're trying to remember something that you're supposed to remember, but you don't. Well, you know what happened? That's good news. It means that your neighbors, those other people in on that bus, they remember that there was someone else on the bus. They may not exactly know their name, they may not remember what he looked like, but they know that it was there. That's already good news. That's a good start. So then the bus would stop, and some actions would take place in order to figure out who that person was, and hopefully retrieve this person, get this person back on board. So you see, you need to make sure that your new information has a network set up so that it doesn't get lost in that mess that is in your mind. Another image that I like to give to my students when I'm explaining them how to remember words better is quite poetic. Imagine you're walking out of the forest and you see a beautiful field, meadow, full of flowers. It's covered in grass, and you don't see the path. But you know that there is this tree there where you want to go. So, why don't you see the path? Do you think that no one has ever walked there? Well, the thing is that if one person walked on this field, would you see the path? Probably if you walked right after this person, but not in 5 minutes. Then, if two people walked, three and four, if a group of tourists walked along the same path, that would be noticeable. And the more people walk to that tree, the more noticeable that path would be. This is what is happening when you're revisiting that word. So every time you revisit the word, you're creating a stronger connection, the stronger highway to that word, and it's much easier to forget. That is the reason why those paths don't really get lost even after long winters when they're covered in snow. So this is why you should keep reviewing words again and again in your mind to make sure that this path will never get lost. And keep in mind that forgetting curve would help you making sure that this path stays. Let's talk about what you can do to remember words more efficiently. As we've already discussed, you need to do two things. First, you need to Try to remember these words as often as possible. And secondly, you need to create as many connections with other already well-established neurons in your mind to make sure that they know about the presence of this new word. As far as it goes about recalling the words repeatedly, that's all your self-discipline. You have to create the schedule that works for you. There are tons of tools and techniques and strategies that I'm sure you've heard of that can help you with that. Anything start about writing down the list of words, as I've already mentioned. They may sound boring, but they help you keep all the words organized. You could create cards that take a bit more time, like writing the English word on one side and the Russian word on the other. You could use some apps like Quizlet. Have you heard of Quizlet? That's great. So it already has a lot of card set on different topics that someone has very generously shared with everyone. They work more or less the same way as the cards do, but they save you the time of writing them down, even though writing by hand is very useful for your memory because it connects with your motor skills. So think about that. In terms of trying to establish as many connections as you can with this newcomer, let's say, so the method of associations is very useful. What does it mean? So whenever you say a word that causes you some difficulty remembering, you could think of what comes to your mind when you hear the word. Let's take the word prominent. Prominent. What does it mean? First of all, it means someone famous, well known. It can be a person or a thing, like a prominent writer or a prominent part of this composition. Prominent. To me it sounds a little bit like promote. Another word, promote, right? When you promote something, you invest in it so that it becomes famous and well known. So if you promote something, it becomes prominent. Well, make sure that you don't think that these words come from the same origin. They don't, but they sound alike, and it can help you in memorization. From practice, I can tell you, the weirder these associations are, the better you remember them. Another useful exercise, try and create sentences with these words. But the problem is that you shouldn't really create a sentence like, he was prominent. Well, who is he? Why was he prominent? You have to say something that's meaningful, something that relates to your personal life or to your world that you live in. For example, you could say, Joanna Rowling is a prominent writer who's written a series of books about a young magician. Well, you see how much context I've given? So now, whenever I think of Joanna Rowling, I will immediately think of the word prominent, hopefully. Create a couple of more sentences connecting that word with other famous people, prominent people, or things. There is a bonus to creating sentences like that. If you delete this word prominent out of this sentence, you can use this sentence as a fill in the gaps exercise. And you see that the context around this word helps you understand what word you needed. So you could later in a week, let's say, or when you kind of forget about this word, but not completely, you could do this exercise trying to fill in the gap. And what would you think of famous, well-known, and hopefully prominent, the new word that we're trying to learn right here. And the last thing that you have to keep in mind, if you want to be able to use this word in speaking, you have to make sure that you use it in speaking while learning this word. Just looking at the words or writing them down will not get them into your active speaking vocabulary. It's the same thing about reading the bike manual. Do you think you would be able to ride a bicycle if you just look at it? Or if you read the manual? Or if you rewrite the manual? No, unless you get on that bike and try to ride it, first badly, probably falling down, like making mistakes. You would never start riding it freely. But once you get over that stage of trying repeatedly, you will not be able to write it. Same about words. If you want to use it in speaking, speak it. If you want to know how to write it, write it. Don't just look at it. Else, they will just stay in your passive memory and you would only be able to recognize them when you see them. Oh, I forgot to tell you about emotions. Is it just a coincidence that hippocampus, that's responsible for processing new information, is also responsible for processing emotions? Have you noticed that you tend to remember happy memories better than bad memories? And in general, you remember things that, in general, the stronger the emotion is, the better you remember this event, or in our case, the word. So you do need to have a very positive attitude. If you think it was useful, please don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. See you later in other videos. Bye bye.